Israel's plausible genocide in Palestine continues to dominate headlines as more Americans seem convinced it's time for a ceasefire. According to polling from Data for Progress, voters continue to support the U.S. calling for a permanent ceasefire and de-escalation of violence in Gaza. This includes 77% of Democrats, 69% of independents, and even 56% of Republicans. This polling data comes as the U.S. says that the likelihood of a ceasefire is increasing by the day. Here's a spokesman for the State Department.
So our goal is to achieve a deal to reach a humanitarian pause and the release of hostages as soon as possible. Certainly we would welcome getting one by this weekend. What I can say about the overall progress is that we made significant progress towards an agreement last week when we had officials from the United States government engaging in the region. We continue to pursue further progress this week. American officials across the government continue to be engaged on this question. We are trying to push this deal over the finish line. We do think it's possible. But as you've heard me say before, ultimately, some of this comes down to Hamas and whether Hamas is willing to agree to a deal that would provide significant benefits to the Palestinian people that they claim to represent.
While that deal is hammered out, ostensibly, Gazans are continuing to struggle with food shortages and widespread famine. Hundreds of thousands of Gazan women and children risk death from starvation as Israel refuses to let humanitarian aid into the area. Gaza's Arab neighbors, Egypt and Jordan, sent flights into the Strip to airdrop desperately needed aid, much to the joy of the Palestinians on the ground below. Some Western nations, including France, also participated in the airdrop campaign.
Well, while the Biden administration seems gung-ho that a ceasefire deal could be imminent, the actual players involved in such a deal have attempted to tap down on these expectations that there will be a ceasefire anytime soon. Per CNN, officials from Israel, Hamas, and Qatar have cautioned against U.S. President Joe Biden's optimism that a hostage for ceasefire deal in Gaza could be reached by the end of this week, suggesting that differences remain as negotiators work to secure an agreement. Now, following the Data for Progress poll demonstrating that while increasing amounts of Americans may want a ceasefire, they do still stand firmly with Israel, according to a new poll from Harvard-Harris that shows overwhelming U.S. support for Israel, with 82% of registered voters backing Israel over Hamas, 68% saying Israel tried to avoid civilian casualties, and 67% saying that they would support a ceasefire only after Hamas is removed and all hostages are freed. So I highlight this poll because I feel like it goes against a lot of the other polling you've cited. It's very clear that, two-thirds of people saying they only want a ceasefire. They want a ceasefire, but that must involve the defeat of Hamas first. Also, most voters, according to this poll, support an Israel ground invasion. The question being, do you support Israel continuing its ground invasion into southern Gaza to root out the final elements of Hamas, or oppose it because 1.2 million civilians have taken shelter there and will be under significant risk of harm if Israel pushes forward? 63% say go forth, 37% oppose.
Yeah. So the poll I cited also includes release of hostages. So it sounds to me like in both polls, people are responding to the desire to release hostages. And since the numbers aren't that different, when you add on and Hamas steps down, it does really seem like that's what people are responding to, which is why it's so tragic that Israel rejected a deal weeks ago now that could have resulted in the release of all hostages. All they have to do is confirm that there is a permanent ceasefire, not one of these pauses. So it's really clear. I want to be really clear to the audience the kind of rhetorical game that's being played here. When you're hearing from Max Miller there, the State Department spokesperson, that there are these pauses contemplated, et cetera. The reason those deals keep getting rejected is because Israel has stated clearly that it plans to permanently occupy the Gaza Strip, establish a border zone, an occupied zone within the Gaza Strip, not allow there to be any self-determination or self-government within Gaza, and there is a wall. Wait a minute, I'm going to finish this point. And Egypt is constructing a wall outside the Rafah Gate, which many people anticipate is going to be used to corral the remaining Palestinians that survived this attack out of Palestine altogether and literally ethnically cleanse them from the region. So of course there need to be some assurances from the perspective of Palestinians that they're going to get a right to return to the Gaza Strip, on top of the fact that, of course, this whole conflict started because 75 years ago they were kicked out of their land in the Nakba and desperately want a right to return to their homes in what is now Israel.
The Israelis have not taken the position that the Palestinians can have no self-governance. They have no self-governance right now because they haven't had.
Robby, they have. When you say that you want a panel
they
of
voted. You talked. My turn. They voted for Hamas 17 years ago, and there have been no elections since then. They have no meaningful ability to dissent or choose their own government. The Israelis have not taken the position that they cannot choose their own leadership, just that they cannot choose Hamas, which is well in keeping with the public polling, which is utterly against Hamas continuing to exist or have power in the Gaza Strip. Sure. That is what the polling supports.
Colonial imperial power says
you can call it colonial imperialism, but that's what people want. They want the defeat of Hamas, a terrorist group that attacked Israel. Sorry, and that's what they're going to get. And it's going to continue until Hamas is defeated.
Your point is loud and clear. I'm so glad that you are so confident putting your big voice behind statements like that, and I don't have to even respond. So I'm going to get to one of these other points of the polling, which is this question. It seems like most voters seem to believe that Israel is specifically trying to avoid civilian casualties, and it's worth noting how untrue that really is. According to an Oxfam report, the daily death rate in Gaza is higher than any other major 21st century conflict. At the time, this was published in January before the starvation crisis really kicked in, because remember, the West backed the withdrawal of the major humanitarian support through UNRWA because of these crumbling allegations that a substantial number of the UNRWA staff members were involved in the October 7th attacks. Even before the starvation started to kick in, remember earlier this week we covered that they had to bury a 2-month-old child that never knew a moment of peace in its life, that the Israeli military was killing 250 Palestinians per day, on top of people who are dying from hunger, disease, cold, etc. And it's not just incidental. Israel is specifically blocking food aid into the region. And remember earlier this month, attacked food trucks that were trying to enter Gaza. So there is a really important question that people should ask, is that can you say that Israel is trying to avoid civilian casualties when there's a famine afoot and when you've intentionally tried to block aid into the region?
Look, I certainly think Israel could do a better job of trying to avoid civilian casualties. We've highlighted a lot of abuses on the show, including the killing of hostages who are trying to return, who are waving the white flag. I absolutely think Israel could do more, but you and I, in thinking that, are in the minority according to this polling. So,
yeah, I think that has a lot to do with how horrible the media coverage has been. You cannot turn on the Western media without being told the vicious lie that while Israelis respect life, Palestinians don't. Even as everyone who I think consumes news outside of the mainstream media can see with their very own eyes how little respect there is for life if you're literally attacking food trucks. And of course, we've also covered briefly on this show the extent to which right-wing protesters in Israel have set up bouncy castles outside of the gate where all of this humanitarian aid is waiting to go in, celebrating the ability to block aid to a population of 2.3 million people who are literally starving to death and having to bury babies because they're not able to get enough nutrition. I mean, when we say this is one of the biggest humanitarian crises of our lifetime, that is really true. And seeing unprecedented numbers of support for Palestinians is incredible. The polls that you show, that even you cite, represent an enormous shift from the status quo in America, where because we've been told that Israel is our greatest ally and the only democracy in the Middle East, have been denied knowledge about the apartheid state and the conditions that Palestinians have been living in. There is a lot of built-in support for Israel, and what we've been seeing over the last 4 months is how fast it's been able to crumble in the face of these images. The 12-year-old girl hanging with her legs ripped off from the Super Bowl night massacre. The pending doom as the ground invasion looms in Rafah, where this population has been herded like cattle after being told that this place and this place and this place was going to be a safe zone and then being bombed when they get there. You have Israelis sitting in schools and sniping people from schools and hospitals, which was the narrative that we were always told about Hamas, that they use schools, they use hospitals for covers and as theaters from attack. And I think that's really had a profound effect on how Americans are perceiving this conflict. And we'll continue to see those polls skew not only in favor of the humanitarian interests of Palestinians, but also against the political interests of Joe Biden as he's seen as being complicit in this horror.
And apparently just wildly exaggerating, if not totally fabricating, the idea that there's some pending ceasefire deal.
Right.
That seems like that was a transparent move to stave off embarrassment in Michigan yesterday.
And it did not work.
It did not work. More Rising right after this.